Long Voyage back, page 320. From the minute he and Ollie began trying to barter for food, Frank sensed that something was wrong. As they made their way up from the docks, the streets seemed strangely empty. The few people in the doorways of houses or bars or on the street corners all seemed to be standing for the sole purpose of staring at Frank and Ollie, as if they were enemy agents. Black food vendors with whom they'd bartered a half-dozen times were now either gone or refused even to talk to them. They went into a bar to find out what was happening. Even at 5 in the afternoon, Bosso's was packed. People were standing 2 and 3 deep at the long bar along one wall, and the dozen small tables across the room were all filled. Almost everyone was drinking water, or a special post-war punch spiked with rum. Imported alcohol had disappeared. Frank and Ollie stood awkwardly in the crowded space between the bar and the tables. Everyone in the bar was white, except for 3 black men at the far end, surrounded by a halo of conspicuous space. Many of the patrons kept glancing nervously at the entrance, as if expecting an important but formidable visitor. Most of them talked in low voices or whispers, as if they were in church. There was no boisterousness or joy. The one loud drunk, who made an effort at jollity, seemed to be deranged and soon lapsed into gloomy mumbling. Captain Ollie wedged himself between 2 customers to press against the bar. "Say, fella," he asked the nearest bartender, "who died?" The bartender, a big man with thick glasses and a cowboy hat, came toward Ollie with a frown. The other patrons grew even quieter at Ollie's loud outburst. "What do you mean, who died?" the bartender suddenly asked Ollie. "The way I figure it," Captain Ollie replied, "everyone's mother just got run over by a steamroller. Never been in such a dreary place. You got a law against talking in a normal voice?" "You're a stranger here?" the bartender asked belligerently. The 2 other bartenders, though still mixing drinks, were half-turned, listening. "Hell, I've lived here for days," Ollie said. "You fellas act as if you just learned that your blind date was a Russian missile." "You want a drink?" the bartender asked. "The price of drinks these days being what it is, I think I'll make water last into my next incarnation." The bartender shrugged his big shoulders and moved away to another customer. Ollie turned to the tall, slender man on his left. "What's bothering everyone, fella, huh?" he asked. The man turned and looked coldly down at him. He shrugged. "The blacks may be going to riot," he said. "I see. What's their gripe?" "I wouldn't know," the tall man said, looking away and lifting his almost empty glass to his lips. "You don't seem much bothered," said Ollie. "I'm leaving tomorrow morning," the man said neutrally. "Well, ain't that nice," said Ollie. "Where you heading?" The man placed a silver dollar on the bar and then brushed past Ollie and left. Ollie returned to Frank. "You give it a try, Frank," he said. "I guess I ain't got the personality I once did." A big black man with glittering white eyes and a sweat-covered face abruptly stood in front of them. He was dressed in a neat brown suit, totally inappropriate for the sweltering weather. "You want to know why it's so gloomy in Bosso's today?" he asked, smiling, his gleaming eyes either stoned or mad. "Yeah," said Frank, "we'd appreciate it," and, glancing at Ollie, followed the man over to the empty space that surrounded his friends. The other 2 men were dressed in the casual and unpretentious style more usual among Virgin Islanders, white or black. "These people want to know what's going on," the first man grinned absurdly at his 2 friends. "I've promised to tell them." The other 2 blacks, subdued and sullen compared to the man who introduced himself as Mr. Stutter, looked at him and then turned back to the bar and their glasses of water. "Everyone's a little touchy these days," Mr. Stutter said. "Why?" Frank asked. "Well, you see," said Mr. Stutter, turning his glittering eyes on Frank, "the obliteration of San Juan has had a certain depressing effect on everyone. We all thought we were safe here, and then, boom! We find out we're not. 5 days ago, the cruise ship St. Augustine, loaded with almost 1,000 passengers, most of them white, sailed away from the white enclave at Kinneil Bay on St. John's. Tomorrow, the Norway does the same." "Where are they going?" Frank asked. "The St. Augustine is going to Rio de Janeiro, and the Norway, the beautiful Norway is sailing to, South Africa." "Jesus," said Frank. "This mass exodus of whites to South Africa is having a certain alienating effect on some of the blacks," Mr. Sutter went on, grinning, as if he was telling a dirty story. "Certain resentments seem to have arisen, a feeling, as you mainlanders would put it, of being screwed." "Are most of the people here planning to sail tomorrow on the Norway?" Frank asked. "All but my 2 taciturn friends here," Mr. Stutt replied, gesturing at the 2 blacks next to him at the bar. "They are deficient in gold, and in the belief that South Africa is nigger heaven." "You going?" asked Frank. You're goddamn right. If I'm to choose between my identity as a live rich man or a dead black man, I have no trouble in opting for the Norway and Cape Town. The South Africans might not like the colour of my skin, but they always like the colour of gold. A commotion at the entrance of the bar distracted Frank. The people nearest the door began to talk loudly, and, as if a plug had been pulled at the door, everyone in the room began to be sucked towards the entrance. "They're coming!" someone shouted, and several men produced guns. A man now stood aiming a .38 at the three blacks at the bar. Mr. Studder, sweating, grinned grotesquely. "I assure you," he said to the thick-set white man with the gun, "I am not part of the revolution." The other two blacks were looking balefully at the man with the gun, but appeared to be unperturbed. "I want you three to turn around," the white man said, "and lean against the bar with your arms outstretched. I'm going to check you for weapons." Captain Ollie had left for the entrance, where the sound of gunshots could be heard, but Frank stood watching the confrontation. "I'm sailing on the Norway," Mr. Stutter insisted, trying to establish his connection with the good guys. "And although it makes me gag, I must confess that I'm on your side." None of the three blacks had moved. "I said turn around," repeated the white man, looking nervous, "and lean forward with your hands flat on the bar. Now!" He poked his gun in Sutter's ribs and gave him a shove. "My dear man," Mr. Stutter began, but even as he spoke, one of the other blacks had sprung forward, grabbed the man's gun arm and began wrestling with him. The other came to his aid while Frank stood tensely in surprise and indecision. Within 3 or 4 seconds the white man staggered back against Frank, and one of the blacks was crouched down, levelling the gun at them and backing toward the rear entrance of the bar. An explosive roar from the bar sent the man staggering backward, his shirt shredded. The other black fled. Frank turned to see one of the bartenders standing beside the bar with a smoking shotgun. A distant explosion was heard from outside. "Frank, let's go!" Ollie shouted from the front entrance. "Get out of here, Sutter," the barman ordered. "Yes," said Mr. Sutter, and tight-lipped and terrified he darted out the back. When Frank left the bar with Ollie, the bright afternoon sunlight blinded him. He could only see a few figures moving rapidly from left to right towards the docks. The gunfire was coming from off to the left and from behind the buildings across the street. There was another loud explosion, and the ground trembled under their feet. Then he could see smoke rising from the boutique across the street. As he and Ollie turned right to make for the docks, Frank saw an ancient brown tank rumbling down the street towards them, a handful of soldiers running at a crouch alongside and behind it. He and Ollie scurried along the sidewalk, watching the tank and the half-dozen soldiers, mostly black, Frank noted with surprise, head past them in the direction of what Frank assumed were the black rioters. A small Datsun heading towards the docks with a cracked windshield careered up onto the curb nearby to avoid the soldiers and the tank. The white driver, bleeding from a head wound, looked terror-stricken. At the corner of the first street, still a block from the docks and the marina where Mollycoddle was tied, a cluster of white civilians were crouched behind 2 overturned vegetable carts, looking up the street where the tank had stopped and where the shots were coming from. Most of the men had either a rifle or a handgun. Another explosion rocked the pavement, and Frank turned to see that the tank had turned around and its smoking cannon was now aimed down the street at them. Half the soldiers had disappeared, but the others were crouched down behind parked cars. 2 were firing at the whites. "The bastards are firing at us!" someone shouted. "Let's go!" another yelled, and 2 of them began running towards the docks, soon followed by the other 4. A piece of sidewalk popped up in front of Frank as he and Ollie followed. It took him 2 strides to realise that it was a bullet. They were all running now, and within a minute's time had arrived at the dock area where cars were being overturned as barricades, while a few soldiers, here mostly white and looking bewildered, made half-hearted efforts to direct the flow of people. Along the 3 blocks of waterfront, Frank could see only a single additional tank. It sat with its cannon aimed incongruously and ominously out to sea. At the marina where Mollycoddle was moored were dozens of men, women and children, mounds of luggage. Most were gathered near the small boat dock trying to get out to the Norway, which was still at anchor half a mile out in the harbour. There was no crowd around Mollycoddle, and as he approached, Frank saw why. Macklin and Sheila were standing on the foredeck, each with an automatic rifle held at the hip and aimed at the dock. Although Sheila looked like she could probably handle a gun, Macklin looked like he wanted to use his, and his grim face alone would discourage most people. The ground in the marina parking lot abruptly exploded less than 50 feet away, sending people running in all directions and leaving 4 or 5 men sprawled on the ground. When Frank turned back, he saw that the rafted seaward to Mollycoddle was Scorpio, so low in the water compared to the Hatteras he hadn't seen her at first. With a surge of joy he saw Jim and Lisa coming out of the main cabin with empty boxes for transferring Mollycoddle's food to Scorpio. Jim waved and shouted, We found her on Scorpio. For Christ's sake, don't stand there, Macklin shouted. Get aboard, we've got to get away. Where's Jean and Neil? Frank asked as he and Ollie boarded Mollycoddle. They're not back, Macklin shouted. They'll never get back through this. Get us out of here. Frank looked at Sheila, who looked back at him questioningly. Her face was pale. Glancing at his watch, Frank realised that Neil and Philip were already a half hour overdue. Oscar ran across from Scorpio. Pull us out of here, he said, his small eyes wider. They'll sink us. Tony, Macklin shouted. 10 feet away, Mollycoddle's main windshield shattered as 3 neat holes appeared in the glass. Macklin crouched down, and Oscar threw himself to the deck. Frank, standing numbly, now realised there was gunfire all around them. Tony sprang from Scorpio and in a couching run joined Macklin huddled behind Mollycoddle's coaming. Get us out of here! Macklin shouted at him. Tony crawled over to the controls and, glancing fearfully around him, stood up and turned on the engine. Get the dock lines! Macklin shouted at Frank and Oscar. Another explosion boomed behind them. Frank turned to see the dock one berth away and burst into fragments and a body go flying off into the water. Sheila clutched his arm. We can still wait, she said. We can't desert them. Get the goddamn dock lines! Macklin shrieked at Frank and Oscar. Jim appeared beside Frank, slightly hunched over. We're not leaving yet, are we? He asked. The smoke from recent explosions, though, was blowing away from them, prevented them from seeing much of what was happening in the streets. Along the docks, people were running, crouching, stampeding into boats to get out to Norway, occasionally shooting, seemingly at random, back into the smoke. No, we're not, Frank said in a low voice. Macklin, wild-eyed, suddenly leapt up, knife in hand, ran forward along Mollycoddle's side and slashed the forward dock line. With the wind blowing the yacht against the dock, Mollycoddle remained where she was, but when the 2 aft lines were cut, Tony would be able to motor off. As Frank, Sheila and Jim watched, Macklin ran aft and cut the other 2 dock lines. Go, Tony! He shouted. But Frank and Jim both came alive at once and ran to the helm. Not yet, said Frank. Tony stared back at him, his usual placid face filled with fear, then looked to Macklin for support. Get out of the way, Frank, Macklin said loudly, with his accustomed icy calm. I'm saving lives. Get us out of here, Tony. Macklin's automatic rifle was aimed directly at Frank and Jim. If you're so hot to be with Neil and Jean and Philip, get off the boat. You too, Sheila. Sheila, still holding her automatic rifle, aimed vaguely shoreward, looked at Frank, then at Macklin, and finally back at the scene on shore. Oh my God, she said. When Frank let his eyes follow hers, she saw Neil and Katya coming through the smoke in the parking lot, one pulling a garden cart, the other a wheelbarrow.